It was one of those bright mornings when the city never seemed to rest. The tall buildings around the television studio caught the sunlight and reflected it like glass mirrors, while the streets below buzzed with energy. Inside the studio, a different kind of rush filled the air. Producers, camera operators, makeup artists, and assistants moved in a hurry, preparing for the big live talent show that millions of people watched every weekend. The laughter, the noise, and the clatter of shoes on the shiny floors created a strange kind of excitement that only live television could bring. Everyone was in a cheerful mood. The hosts were cracking jokes in the hallway. The crew was adjusting lights and microphones, and the director shouted orders through his headset. Everything had to be perfect. After all, this show was known for its humor as much as its performances. The audience loved funny moments just as much as they loved talent. And today, the producers had planned something they thought would make people laugh. Near the edge of the set, an elderly woman slowly swept the floor. She wore a faded gray uniform and a pair of worn-out shoes. Her silver hair was tied neatly in a bun, and her movements were quiet, careful, almost invisible to those rushing past her. Her name was Margaret Dawson, but to most of the staff, she was just the cleaner. She had been working in the studio for years, always early, always polite and always keeping to herself. Margaret rarely spoke unless spoken to. She didn't like attention. She worked quietly, making sure every corner was spotless before the cameras started rolling. To her, it was an ordinary job that helped her pay rent and buy her groceries. She never expected anyone to notice her, and most of the time they didn't. But that morning, something unexpected happened. One of the show's assistant producers, a young man trying to impress his boss, noticed Margaret sweeping near the stage. "Hey," he said to one of the cameramen with a grin. "Wouldn't it be funny if we got her to play the piano during the show? Like a little comedy bit before the main act?" The cameraman laughed. "You mean the cleaning lady? She probably doesn't even know what a piano is." They both chuckled, and soon the idea spread around. The main producer, always eager for a viral moment, loved it. "Perfect," he said, clapping his hands. "We'll bring her on stage for a quick joke before the live performance starts. The crowd will love it. A little humor before the big acts never hurts." The plan was simple. They would call Margaret on stage during the live broadcast, pretend to ask her to play something on the piano, and let the audience laugh when she fumbled. It wasn't meant to be cruel. At least that's how they justified it. Just light entertainment. Margaret knew nothing about their plan. When the show started, the stage lights were blindingly bright. The audience clapped and cheered as the host stepped onto the stage, dressed in a shiny suit and flashing his usual charming smile. "Good evening, everyone," he shouted. "Welcome back to another night of talent, surprises, and laughter." The crowd roared. He went through the usual introductions, cracking jokes that had the audience in stitches. Then, with a mischievous grin, he looked toward the side of the stage where Margaret stood quietly with her broom. "Now, before we bring out our next performer," he said playfully, "I think we should give someone else a chance. Someone who's been working behind the scenes every single day." The camera turned toward Margaret. She froze, unsure what was happening. The audience began to clap, thinking it was part of the show. "You there?" the host said with a grin. "Come on up here, my friend. Don't be shy. Tonight you're our special guest." Margaret blinked in confusion and looked around as if hoping he meant someone else. But the host was pointing directly at her. An assistant gestured for her to come forward. The lights were hot on her face as she slowly stepped onto the stage, holding her broom awkwardly in one hand. The audience laughed softly, not in a mean way at first, but out of amusement. She was tiny, fragile-looking, her uniform slightly too big for her frame. The contrast between her and the glamorous host made the whole thing seem comical. "What's your name, dear?" the host asked into the microphone. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Margaret, what a lovely name," he said loudly, turning to the audience for applause. "Now, Margaret, we've all seen you working hard around here, keeping our studio shining. But tonight, we thought it's time you take the spotlight. How about you show us your hidden talent?" Margaret shook her head, flustered. "Oh no, sir, I don't have any talent. I just clean the floors." The audience laughed again, but this time a few people looked uneasy. The host smiled wider, sensing the moment. "Come now, don't be modest. Everyone has a talent. Tell you what, let's have a little fun. See that piano over there?" Margaret turned her head toward the grand piano standing at the center of the stage. Its black surface gleamed under the lights. She looked back at him, confused. "Why don't you play something for us?" he said, grinning. "Just a few notes." "Anything." Her eyes widened. "Oh, I can't play, sir. I've never—" "Come on, Margaret," he interrupted, holding the microphone like a magician revealing a trick. "You can do it! Let's give her some encouragement, folks." The audience clapped again, cheering and shouting, "Play! Play!" Margaret's heart pounded. She didn't know what to do. Every part of her wanted to walk away, but all eyes were on her. The cameras were rolling, and she didn't want to cause trouble or look rude. So hesitantly, she nodded. She shuffled toward the piano, her shoes tapping softly on the wooden floor. The host followed behind her, smiling at the audience as if to say, "This is going to be good." When she reached the piano, she looked at the keys uncertainly. The bright lights made her eyes water. The microphone was placed close to her face. She could hear the faint whisper of laughter from the front row. She sat down slowly, her hands resting awkwardly on her lap. "I really don't know what to play," she whispered. "Just press a few keys," the host said kindly, though his tone carried a hint of amusement. "We'll see what happens." Margaret lifted her trembling hands toward the keyboard. Her fingers hovered above the smooth white keys. For a moment the studio went quiet, waiting for the joke to unfold. The first key she pressed made a soft sound that echoed through the hall. A few people laughed gently, thinking it was part of the act. She pressed another and another, hesitant, unsure. The host chuckled beside her, glancing at the camera. "She's a natural, folks," he said jokingly, and the crowd laughed again. But then something changed. Margaret paused, her eyes focused on the piano. A quiet memory stirred inside her like an old song she hadn't heard in decades. Her fingers rested on the keys, and for the first time in years, they didn't feel foreign. They felt familiar. Her hands stopped trembling. Her breathing slowed. The laughter around her faded into the background. The host was still smiling, but his voice trailed off when he saw her face. Her expression was different now, calm, focused, almost peaceful. It was as if the noise of the studio disappeared, and only she and the piano existed. She pressed another key, then another, forming a small melody. The sound was soft, delicate, but there was something about it, something real, something beautiful. The audience quieted slightly, unsure if this was still part of the joke. Margaret didn't notice them anymore. She was somewhere else, someplace far away where music still lived, and that's how it began. No one knew what was coming next, not even her. But in that quiet, uncertain moment, as the old woman sat beneath the glaring lights and the cameras rolled live across the nation, something extraordinary was about to happen. And the world, without realizing it yet, was about to witness a performance it would never forget. The room had quieted down, but the laughter had not completely disappeared. Some audience members still thought this was part of the comedy act. A harmless, funny moment with the little elderly cleaner awkwardly sitting at the grand piano. The host, standing beside her, gave a small encouraging nod, smiling as if to say, "This is just for fun." Margaret's hands hovered over the keys for a moment. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep, steadying breath. She wasn't sure where the sudden calm had come from. It was strange, almost like a fog lifting inside her mind. Her fingers slowly began to move, pressing one key after another. At first, the notes were soft, hesitant, almost shy. But there was a rhythm there, delicate but deliberate, a melody that seemed to rise naturally from her memory. The audience began to notice the change. The gentle clatter of keys no longer sounded awkward. There was something different in the air. The sound wasn't just noise, it carried emotion, something tender and sincere. A hush fell over the crowd. Even the host, who had expected a quick laugh, stopped smiling and tilted his head, listening carefully. Margaret's eyes remained closed. She let the music guide her. Each note seemed to tell a story she had kept locked away for decades. The audience could sense it, even if they didn't know the story yet. Her fingers moved with grace, striking the keys with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone who had not played in years. There was no hesitation now, only flow, and the room, once filled with the sound of chatter and laughter, had gone completely silent. A few audience members shifted in their seats, leaning forward. They whispered to each other, confused, unsure what was happening. This wasn't a joke anymore. The soft, tender melody seemed to pull at their hearts. The laughter had faded, replaced by something heavier, something deeper, Some felt goosebumps rise on their arms. Some felt tears prick at the corners of their eyes. The host stood frozen beside her, his usual confident voice absent. His smile disappeared, replaced by a look of pure astonishment. He had expected a few funny notes, maybe a clumsy tune, something to get a laugh for the cameras. Instead, what he heard was music that filled the room. Music that was moving in ways he had not thought possible. Margaret's hands moved faster now, gliding across the keys, each note more expressive than the last. There was a power to it, but also softness. There was sadness, yes, but also beauty and hope. It was the kind of music that seemed to belong somewhere else, somewhere far from the bright lights and the clapping crowd. It was music that had been hidden away for years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Backstage, the producers exchanged panicked glances. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was live television, a light-hearted show, meant to entertain with smiles and laughter. Yet the moment they heard the notes drifting out from the stage, they realized this was no ordinary performance. One of them whispered, "Is she really playing like that?" Another shook their head in disbelief. "I don't understand. She's just the cleaning lady."
How could she know that much?
The audience remained captivated. Some couldn't stop staring at Margaret. Others had their hands clasped over their mouths, unable to believe what they were hearing. The music carried a depth that made people forget where they were. A few older viewers leaned back in their seats, silent, remembering pieces of their own lives that were long buried, memories that had been awakened by the fragile, yet commanding touch of her fingers on the keys. Margaret didn't notice the reaction. She wasn't thinking about the audience, the host, or the cameras. Her mind was elsewhere. She remembered a small music school where she had once learned to play, a place filled with the soft hum of pianos and the quiet encouragement of a teacher who believed in her talent. She remembered the long afternoons spent practicing, the tears she had cried when she made mistakes, the joy that had filled her heart when she finally got a piece right. Those memories had been tucked away for so long, buried under years of routine and silence. And now, just as she had begun to play, they had returned with full force. The host cleared his throat awkwardly, unsure of what to say. His role had always been to entertain, to guide the audience, to joke and charm. But here, beside this elderly woman, he felt insignificant. He stepped back a little, letting her take the stage fully. For the first time, he realized this wasn't about entertainment in the usual sense. This was something different. Something real. The melody shifted slightly. It became more intricate, more expressive, revealing layers of emotion that seemed impossible to contain in a single human being. Margaret's face remained serene, almost peaceful, though her eyes were closed. Each note carried a part of her story, the joy of youth, the pain of loss, the quiet strength that had carried her through years of hardship. In the front row, some younger audience members whispered to each other, unsure what to make of it. "Is she professional?" one asked, wide-eyed. "Can a cleaning lady really play like that?" Another responded, voice barely above a whisper. They didn't know the truth, and it didn't matter. The truth at this moment was irrelevant to the experience. What mattered was the music, how it filled the room and touched every person present. Some felt tears welling in their eyes. Others felt their hearts swelling with emotion. The room had transformed from a place of laughter to a place of reverence, a quiet temple for a performance that felt bigger than the stage itself. Margaret didn't stop. She didn't think about the crowd, the host, or the cameras. Her fingers continued to dance across the keys, producing notes that seemed effortless yet impossibly precise. The audience could hear the story in her music even if they didn't know what it was. It was a story of love, of heartbreak, of resilience, a story that she had lived, though few had ever known. The host finally broke the silence, his voice almost trembling as he spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what to say." The audience held their breath. Even the judges on the side of the stage leaned forward, their usual critical expressions replaced by awe. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her music was speaking louder than any words ever could. The cameras captured every detail, the subtle movement of her hands, the delicate arch of her fingers, the small smile that briefly crossed her lips as she lost herself in the melody. Backstage, the director shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "This wasn't planned. None of this was supposed to happen, and yet somehow it was perfect." Minutes passed, though no one was counting. The audience was completely absorbed. Some people had tears streaming down their faces. Others were frozen, unable to blink as if even the slightest movement would break the magic of the moment. The laughter that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by silence that was heavy but beautiful. Margaret's mind drifted again, recalling the small details of her life that had seemed insignificant before. She remembered the first piano she had ever touched, the warmth of its keys, the encouragement of a teacher who had believed in her when no one else did. She remembered the struggles, the loss, the years of quiet survival, and now in this single moment all of it had returned, flowing through her fingers and into the hearts of every person in the room. The host finally took a small step closer, unsure whether to continue or let her play. He noticed something in her face. A calm determination, a quiet power that could not be interrupted. He realized then that whatever joke they had planned, whatever laughter they had hoped to provoke was no longer relevant. This was bigger than humor. This was real. Margaret's eyes remained closed, but she seemed to be looking somewhere far away, somewhere only she could see. Her fingers continued to move with precision, with grace, with a sense of purpose that captivated everyone. Each note was a message, each chord a story. The audience could feel it in their chests, a gentle stirring that left them breathless. And then, just as the first part of the melody began to reach its peak, a subtle change happened. Margaret paused for the briefest moment, took a deep breath and shifted the rhythm slightly. The music became richer, fuller, more commanding. The room seemed to grow smaller, drawing everyone closer, forcing them to pay attention, forcing them to feel. The host took a small step back, realizing he could no longer control the situation. The show he had directed, the audience he had led, the laughter he had planned, all of it was now secondary to the story that Margaret was telling with her hands. No one had expected this. No one had imagined that the quiet, gentle cleaning lady could hold the attention of an entire studio, could move an audience to tears, could transform a simple piano into an instrument of emotion. And yet, she had done all of that in the first few minutes of what was supposed to be a joke. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary performance. Something extraordinary was unfolding right before everyone's eyes. The moment they thought would be funny had become unforgettable. And the people watching, both in the studio and at home, would remember this moment forever. The soft melody Margaret had started with had now grown into something extraordinary. Every note she played seemed to fill the room with a new kind of energy, one that made people forget about their phones, the cameras, even the jokes that had brought her there in the first place. It was as if time had slowed down. The audience, who had come expecting a laugh, now sat in stunned silence, captivated by the music unfolding before them. Margaret's eyes remained closed, her face serene. Her hands flew across the keys with confidence, striking chords that resonated deep in the chest and the heart. The initial hesitation and fear were gone. The music had taken over, carrying with it memories, feelings, and a story that she could no longer contain. Every person in the room could feel it, even those who had laughed moments ago because it was impossible not to. The host, who had been standing beside her with a nervous smile, finally realized he had underestimated the depth of Margaret's talent. His carefully planned humor had turned into something completely unplanned, completely real, and completely breathtaking. He stepped back to give her space, watching as her fingers danced across the piano with fluid precision. For a moment, he thought the music had a life of its own, like the piano and the player were connected in a way no one could explain. The audience sat frozen, their eyes fixed on Margaret. Some of the older viewers remembered hearing music like this in their youth, perhaps in old concert halls or radio broadcasts, and it stirred something they thought they had lost long ago. Memories of their own lives, of joy and sorrow, rose unbidden as they listened. A few people wiped at their eyes discreetly, trying not to let the tears show, while others simply let them fall freely, unable to resist the pull of the music. Margaret didn't notice them. She didn't notice the audience at all. She wasn't performing for them. She wasn't performing for the host, the judges, or the cameras. She was performing for herself, or maybe, more accurately, for someone she had lost long ago. Each note carried a fragment of her past, a piece of her heart, a memory she had never shared. Her husband had always loved the piano. He had been her first audience, her first critic, her first encouragement. She could almost feel him beside her now, listening, smiling, letting her play without judgment. The melody became richer, more complex. Margaret shifted her hands effortlessly across the keyboard, weaving in higher notes that sparkled like sunlight and lower chords that rumbled like distant thunder. Every movement was precise, every pause intentional. It was clear to anyone watching that she wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story, one that words could never express. The host took a step back again, unsure of whether to speak or remain silent. He realized that whatever words he could say would not match what the music was conveying. This was no longer a joke. This was something far greater than anyone in the studio could have imagined. The laughter he had expected was replaced by awe, and he felt a strange mix of humility and guilt. Humility, because he was witnessing true talent he had never thought existed in someone so quiet, so unassuming. Guilt, because he had almost mocked her, had almost turned her into a punchline. Backstage, the producers and crew were in a frenzy. Cameras that had been aimed for wide, funny shots were now trained on Margaret's hands, capturing every movement, every nuance. The director whispered into his headset, "Get a close-up of her hands. Zoom in on the keys. People have to see this." The cameramen scrambled to adjust their angles, their faces pale with disbelief. The judges, who were usually stone-faced and critical, leaned forward in their chairs. One of them, an older man who had been in the music industry for decades, whispered under his breath, "She's incredible." Another simply shook her head, unable to speak, her eyes wide with astonishment. The music wasn't just good, it was transformative. It was the kind of performance that made you stop thinking about anything else in the world. Margaret's fingers moved faster now, yet there was no rush, no panic. Each note fell into place as if it had been waiting for her all her life. The audience could feel the emotion behind each chord, the loss, the love, the longing, and the strength that had kept her going all these years. Some people held their hands to their hearts, overwhelmed by the beauty and depth of the music. Others leaned closer to their neighbors as if sharing the moment in silence, as if this experience was too fragile to speak of. For Margaret, the music was a bridge between the past and the present, between her memories and her grief, between the life she had lost and the life she was living now. She had carried her talent quietly for decades, letting it sit in the background while she went about her life. And now here it was, alive again, demanding to be heard, demanding to be felt. A subtle smile appeared on her lips, fleeting but noticeable. It wasn't a smile of vanity or pride. It was a smile of recognition, of release. She had been holding on to this music for so long, keeping it tucked away, fearing it might be too late, fearing no one would care, fearing she would be laughed at again. But here, in this moment, her fears vanished. She was not alone. Her music had found ears that would listen, hearts that would feel. The audience shifted in their seats, leaning forward, completely absorbed. Parents clutched their children's hands. Young adults stopped fiddling with their phones. Older viewers sat upright, mesmerized. Even the cameras seemed to move closer, as if drawn to the energy of her hands on the keys. The studio, which had been alive with laughter and chatter just minutes ago, now existed solely for Margaret and her piano. Margaret's performance reached a turning point. The melody swelled, and her fingers flew across the keys with a delicate strength that seemed impossible for someone of her age and stature. Each chord resonated, filling the studio with a richness that seemed to vibrate in every corner. The audience could feel it in their bones, as if the music were speaking directly to them, bypassing words and entering straight into their hearts. The host could no longer hide his amazement. He stepped back completely, letting Margaret take center stage. For the first time, he realized that he was a bystander in something far more important than entertainment. He had thought this would be a funny, light-hearted moment, but he was wrong. This was art, this was passion, this was life itself. Backstage, crew members whispered to each other, "She's real. This is real. I can't believe she's doing this. She's incredible." Some of them had worked in television for years, had seen countless performers, but nothing compared to this. Margaret had taken a simple piano, a stage, and a moment of what was supposed to be humor, and turned it into something unforgettable. Margaret's hands moved with elegance, weaving high notes with low ones, creating harmonies that seemed to tell a story without words. She was no longer the timid, hesitant woman who had sat down at the piano moments ago. She was powerful, confident, and alive in a way that stunned everyone watching. The audience was mesmerized, held captive by the music. No one dared to breathe too loudly. They felt the emotion of the performance, the years of practice and love behind each note, the quiet strength of a woman who had endured so much and yet had never let go of her passion. As she played, a few tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't stop, didn't falter. The music carried her, and in return she carried the room with her. Every note was a testament to resilience, to hidden talent, to the power of believing in oneself. Even when the world has forgotten you, the judges, who were usually quick to critique or applaud politely, were completely silent. They leaned forward, unable to take their eyes off her. One judge, a man known for his strict opinions and harsh feedback, whispered, "She's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like this." Another judge, normally reserved, had her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. The music had transcended entertainment. It had become a force, a living thing in the studio. Margaret's performance continued to build. The melody became more dynamic, more expressive. It told a story that everyone in the room could feel, even if they didn't understand every note. It was a story of love, loss, hope, and perseverance. A story of a life fully lived, quietly and humbly, with passion and dignity. The host, watching beside her, finally took a step forward, unsure of whether to speak. He could barely find words. Every sentence he could think of seemed inadequate. The music had filled the space, leaving no room for anything else. He realized then that he had made a mistake in thinking this would be a simple joke. This was no joke. This was real life, raw and beautiful, unfolding in front of the cameras for the world to see. The audience, now completely silent, could only listen and feel. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others looked at Margaret with wide eyes, overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. They had expected humor, perhaps awkwardness, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, they were seeing and hearing something magical, something they would never forget. Margaret's hands moved with a confidence that seemed to come from another time, another place. She was fully in her element, fully herself, fully alive. The studio lights seemed to dim around her, focusing only on the piano and the woman who had transformed a moment of mockery into something extraordinary. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching. Margaret Dawson was no ordinary woman. She had been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. But now, as her music as Margaret's fingers moved across the piano keys, weaving the melody that held the entire studio in its grip, something shifted behind the scenes. The producers and staff, who had initially planned the moment as a harmless joke, were now scrambling to understand what was happening. Whispers floated through the control room. "Do you know who she is?" One producer asked another. Another shook his head, eyes wide. "No, I thought she was just a cleaner. That's all we knew. But listen to her. She's incredible. She's not just good, she's amazing." One of the assistants began frantically typing on a laptop, trying to pull up any information they could find about her. Emails, past resumes, old footage from studio events, anything that might explain this sudden, extraordinary talent. What they discovered made them stop, frozen with disbelief. Margaret Dawson, the quiet cleaning lady who had swept these same floors for over 20 years, had once been a professional pianist. She had studied music intensely in her youth, trained at a prestigious conservatory, and had performed in concert halls that drew large audiences. Critics had praised her performances for their emotional depth and technical mastery. But then tragedy struck. Her husband, who had been her biggest supporter and inspiration, had passed away unexpectedly in a car accident. The grief had been unbearable. Music, which had once brought her joy, became a reminder of what she had lost. She withdrew from public life, leaving behind the stage, the applause, and the music world she had loved. For years she had lived quietly, taking work as a cleaner in the very studio that now mocked her. The staff couldn't believe it. They had unknowingly brought a living legend onto the stage, someone whose story was far more extraordinary than any act they could have planned. The irony of the situation weighed heavily on them. The woman they thought would be the punchline was actually a virtuoso, whose talent could move hearts and change lives. Back on stage, Margaret continued to play, oblivious to the chaos behind the scenes. Her music told a story that the audience could feel but not fully understand. Every note carried years of hidden emotion, of pain, of love, lost and never forgotten. The melody rose and fell, carrying the weight of her memories, her experiences, and the years she had spent in silence. The host, who had been standing nervously beside her, now looked on with awe. He could see it in her hands, in the way her fingers danced across the keys with precision and grace. He could see it in her face, serene yet full of feeling. This was no ordinary performance. This was a lifetime of experience, a story played out through music, a woman revealing herself to the world in the only way she knew how. The audience felt it too. Some sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down their faces. Others whispered to each other, unable to contain their amazement. The atmosphere in the studio had completely changed. What had begun as a joke had transformed into a moment of pure artistry, a reminder of the beauty that can exist even in the most ordinary-seeming people. Margaret's mind wandered as she played. She remembered her first piano lessons, the hours she had spent practicing, the encouragement of her teachers, and the pride she had felt when she performed her first recital. She remembered the joy of performing with her husband by her side, the way he would smile at her from the front row, the way his presence gave her confidence and strength, and she remembered the day he was gone, how the world had suddenly seemed emptier, colder, and quieter. Music, once her refuge, had become a reminder of the pain she could not bear to face. But now, after years of silence, she had returned to the piano. Not for fame, not for recognition, but because the music had called to her. The studio lights, the audience, the cameras, they were all irrelevant. What mattered was the connection she felt with the keys, with the melody, and with the memory of her husband. The notes she played grew richer, deeper, more expressive. She allowed herself to feel fully, to let the emotions she had suppressed for so long flow through her music, and the audience felt it too. Each chord seemed to resonate with them, stirring emotions they had forgotten or buried. Some were moved to tears, while others simply sat in awe, unable to comprehend the depth of what they were witnessing. Backstage, the production team struggled to keep their composure. One assistant whispered, "We didn't know. She's a professional. How could we have missed that?" Another added, "She's lived here for years and we never realized. It's like she's been hiding in plain sight." The director, who had been coordinating the cameras, shook his head. "We need to capture this. Every moment. People have to see this. This isn't just a performance. It's history." As Margaret continued to play, the music began to shift. It became more intense, more passionate, more alive. The quiet sorrow of the earlier notes gave way to a powerful surge of emotion, a mix of longing, love, and triumph. Her hands moved faster now, yet with control, each note precise and deliberate. The piano seemed to come alive beneath her fingers, responding to her touch, echoing her feelings and amplifying them. The audience was completely enthralled. Some had their hands clasped to their chests, feeling the music in a way they had never experienced before. Others had their eyes closed, letting the melody wash over them, connecting with memories, hopes, and dreams they had long forgotten. The room was no longer a studio filled with lights and cameras. It had become a sacred space, a place where human emotion could be seen, heard, and felt in its purest form. Margaret's mind drifted further back. She remembered the first concert she had played after her husband's death. She had been terrified, unsure if she could perform without collapsing in grief. But when she sat at the piano and let the music flow, she realized that he was still with her in every note, in every chord. That day she had played with everything she had, pouring her soul into the music, and for a brief moment she had felt whole again. Now, decades later, she was experiencing something similar. The studio, the audience, the cameras, it didn't matter. What mattered was the connection she felt with the piano and the music. She had found herself again, even if only for this moment, and the world around her was bearing witness. The host, standing a few steps away, finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't even know what to say. This is incredible. What we thought would be a small, funny moment has turned into something we will never forget." The audience erupted into applause, but it was different this time. It wasn't laughter or casual clapping. It was heartfelt, genuine, filled with awe and respect. People were cheering not just for the music, but for the woman who had dared to let herself be seen, who had shared a part of her soul with the world, even if she hadn't intended to. Margaret didn't stop. She didn't pause to acknowledge the applause or the whispers. She played for herself, for her husband, for the memories that had shaped her life. Each note carried her story, the joy, the love, the grief, and the resilience. And the audience felt it, understood it, and connected with it in a way that transcended words. Backstage, the staff was in awe. One producer muttered, We almost made a huge mistake. We almost turned this into a joke. But look at her now. Look at what she's doing. She's incredible. Another added, This is why talent can never be underestimated. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight. Margaret's music grew even more passionate, more alive. The melody became a wave rising and falling, carrying the audience on a journey they would never forget. Tears flowed freely, hearts swelled, and for those few minutes the studio was united in a shared experience of pure emotion. For Margaret, it was a moment of catharsis. Every sorrow she had held on to, every loss she had endured, every quiet year spent in solitude, all of it flowed through her hands and into the piano. She was no longer just a woman who cleaned floors. She was a woman who had lived, loved, grieved, and triumphed, and her story was being told through the language she had always known best: music. As the final chords approached, the studio remained silent, waiting, hanging on every note. Margaret's eyes were still closed, her face serene as if she were listening to the music as much as she was creating it. And when the last note faded into the air, there was a moment of silence, a collective breath held by everyone in the room, as if no one wanted to break the magic. Then the applause came, slowly at first, then louder and louder until it filled the entire studio. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and crying all at once. Some shouted words of praise. Others simply wept, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. The host stood frozen, unable to fully express what he felt, his eyes wide with admiration and disbelief. Margaret opened her eyes. She looked around the room, seeing the audience, the host, the crew, and finally herself reflected in the shiny surface of the piano. A small, quiet smile appeared on her lips. She had done it. She had shared her story, her talent, her soul, and the world had listened. And in that moment, she realized something profound. She was no longer invisible. She had been seen, truly seen. And for the first time in many years, she felt the warmth of acknowledgement, respect, and love from those around her. The applause continued, but it was more than just clapping. It was a wave of emotion that swept through the studio, touching everyone present. People were on their feet, some with tears in their eyes, others holding their chests, feeling something they couldn't quite put into words. Margaret sat at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She had played from the heart, and in return, the audience had given her something she hadn't felt in years: acknowledgement, respect, and a connection that transcended words. The host, who had spent the entire performance in a state of awe, finally found his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice shaking slightly, I don't even know how to begin. What we have witnessed here tonight is not just talent. It is something beyond words. A story told through music, a life expressed in every note. Margaret, we are honored to have shared this moment with you. Margaret smiled softly, bowing her head slightly, but she didn't speak. Words weren't necessary. The music had said everything. She had given the audience a piece of her soul, and their reactions were enough to fill the silence between them. The judges, who had been watching in stunned silence, began to clap, one by one. Their usual criticism and stern expressions had vanished, replaced by genuine admiration. The oldest judge, who had seen countless performances over his long career, whispered to his colleague, "I've never seen anything like this in my life, never, she's extraordinary." Backstage, the crew was still buzzing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. One camera operator, shaking slightly, muttered, "We almost turned this into a joke, a mockery, but she turned it into something magical. How is that even possible?" Another assistant nodded, eyes wide. "It's like she poured her entire life into those few minutes. Every joy, every sorrow, every moment she's lived, it's all there in her hands." The audience, meanwhile, had been transformed. The energy in the room had shifted completely. What had begun as a light-hearted segment designed to entertain with humor had become a shared human experience. People were crying openly now, some wiping their tears on their sleeves, others holding the hands of friends or strangers beside them. A young woman whispered to the person next to her, "I don't know why, but it feels like she's playing for all of us, for everyone who has ever loved or lost or hoped for something better." Margaret's eyes wandered around the studio as the applause continued. She looked at the host, at the audience, at the judges, and finally at herself in the reflection of the polished piano surface. She had never imagined that one day her music, hidden away for so long, could touch so many hearts at once. She realized in that moment that her years of silence had not been in vain. Every day she had practiced in her mind, every quiet hour she had spent remembering melodies and feeling emotions, had led her to this exact moment. A few minutes passed in a blur. The clapping, cheering, and cries of emotion continued, but Margaret felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had given her best, and the response was overwhelming. For the first time in decades, she felt fully seen and appreciated, not as a cleaner or someone invisible in society, but as a person with a story, a talent, and a life that mattered. The host stepped closer to the piano, speaking softly into the microphone. "Margaret, if you will allow me to say this, you have reminded all of us why music exists. Not for applause, not for fame, not for recognition, but for the human heart. Thank you for sharing this with us." Margaret's lips curved into a gentle smile. She nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in years. She didn't need to speak. The music had done what words could not. It had bridged the gap between her life and the world, connecting her with everyone present in a way that transcended language, age, or circumstance. As the applause gradually began to die down, the host motioned to the audience. "Let's take a moment to recognize what we have just witnessed," he said. "This isn't just a performance. This is history. Margaret Dawson, ladies and gentlemen." The audience erupted once again, some clapping loudly, others whistling in awe. Many were on their feet, cheering, crying, and laughing at the same time. Margaret looked around, overwhelmed by the outpouring of emotion directed at her. She had never imagined that a simple act of playing the piano, something she had once considered lost forever, could create such a profound impact. Among the audience, a few people were recording the moment on their phones, whispering to each other, "This has to be shared. Everyone needs to see this." The energy in the room was electric, alive with admiration and awe. Margaret's music had not only captured hearts, it had ignited them. The judges, still in shock, finally spoke. One of them, a woman known for her strict critique, stood and applauded, tears streaming down her face. "This was not just music," she said. "This was a life lived and expressed. You have reminded us all what it means to truly connect with art. Thank you, Margaret." The oldest judge nodded in agreement. "I've attended hundreds of concerts in my life," he said, voice trembling, "but I have never felt anything like this." She played not just with skill, but with every ounce of her being. That is true talent. Backstage, the production team had stopped their frantic movements. They stood silently, realizing that nothing they could do now would compare to what had just unfolded on stage. Their joke, their idea to entertain the audience with humor, had transformed into something beyond their comprehension. They had witnessed art, raw and unfiltered, that had moved every single person in the room. Margaret, still seated at the piano, slowly closed her eyes and let the silence settle around her. She had poured herself into every note, every chord, every melody. Her heart felt lighter, fuller, as if the years of grief and isolation had been lifted, even if only for a moment. She had given her story to the world, and in return, the world had given her something she had not known she was missing: recognition, respect, and a shared human connection that transcended time and circumstance. The host, now visibly emotional, stepped closer again. "Margaret," he said, voice soft, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that tonight has changed all of us. You have reminded us why we listen, why we watch, why we allow ourselves to feel. Thank you for sharing this gift." Margaret nodded, a small smile on her lips. She didn't need to respond in words. Her music had spoken for her. Her story had been heard. And in that moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in decades. The audience, still clapping and cheering, began to quiet down slowly, allowing the magnitude of the moment to sink in. People looked around at each other, eyes wide, whispering softly, "Did you see that? Did you hear that?" Some reached out to strangers, offering a hand or a smile, as if they had all shared in something sacred together. Margaret stood slowly, her movements graceful despite her age. She took a small bow, her hands resting lightly on the piano. The audience erupted once more, a wave of admiration and emotion sweeping through the studio. It wasn't just applause, it was gratitude. Gratitude for the music, gratitude for the courage of a woman who had dared to share her story, and gratitude for the reminder of what it means to be human. As she stepped away from the piano, the host extended his hand to her, and she accepted it with a gentle smile. The cameras captured every detail, every gesture, every expression, broadcasting it to millions of viewers at home who were watching in disbelief and awe. Social media would soon be flooded with clips of this moment. But in the studio, it was immediate, raw, and unforgettable. Margaret looked around once more, taking in the audience, the crew, the judges, and the host. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel proud. Not proud in a boastful way, but proud in the sense of having reclaimed a piece of herself that had been lost for so long. She had faced fear, she had played with honesty, and she had touched the hearts of everyone present. That was more than enough. The host, regaining some of his composure, addressed the audience one final time. Tonight we witnessed something rare, something extraordinary. Margaret Dawson has reminded us all of the power of music, of the human spirit, and of the beauty that exists even in the most unexpected places. Let us give her one more round of applause. The applause erupted again, louder than before, a mixture of clapping, cheering, and tears. Margaret, standing quietly at the edge of the stage, took it all in. She had given everything she could, and the response was overwhelming. She had turned a moment meant for humor into an experience that would be remembered for a lifetime. And as the audience slowly began to settle, the studio lights dimmed slightly, focusing on Margaret for one final lingering shot. In that quiet glow, she seemed almost luminous, a testament to resilience, talent, and the enduring power of the human heart. For those present and for those watching at home, it was clear. This was more than a performance. This was a reminder that life, even in its quietest and most overlooked moments, can hold extraordinary beauty.